I was in a hospital room in Newport News, Virginia, part of a prayer and praise session with my soon-to-be in-laws surrounding the man who unfortunately and tragically would never become my father-in-law. There was praying and crying and pleading and a weird joy that gave me the feeling that something larger was happening in that room, and I was an outsider to it all. A few days later, at the funeral of my never-to-be father-in-law, I decided to become a part of that happening and accept Jesus into my heart. Something was happening, and I wanted to be a part of it. I'm not here to evangelize. I tell that story, and I had a church past that led to that moment that started long before the hospital room, but I tell that story to give you a starting point for the next chapter. After our wedding in 2001, Julie and I attended a few churches, both in Maryland and in North Carolina. When we landed at our most recent church in 2005, we really needed a stabilizing force in our lives. We were in over our head trying to run a business. We had a toddler. We found that stabilizing force, not only in a theological base of knowledge that I know was lacking, but also some practical advice on parenting, relationships, and marriage. We also made friends and started planting roots in the community. We went on to volunteer for the church. Julie worked for the church. Our kids grew up at the church. We were baptized and dedicated, and children accepted Jesus at that church. Quite an impact. It's hard to pinpoint if we changed, the church changed, or maybe both. In the broad Christian church, there were seemingly constant stories in the news of churches and church leaders falling for a myriad of reasons. Financial scandals, scandals of abuses, including abuse of power, sexual abuse, spiritual abuse. I look at my time at the church as I would the growing of a child into adulthood. We need the comfort, security, and guidance through the infant through early school years of church. Then came adolescence, where logic collides with belonging, where you look for more individualistic identity and mutual respect from the sources of leadership and power, rather than a relationship of control and authority. So now that I've hit adolescence and early adulthood in my church time, I am now trying to reconcile the good things that I have learned and experienced with the seemingly unchristian actions that I have viewed in both my local church and that have been on display from churches around the world. How do I disentangle the message of love that is taught in the gospel and the abuses of the people and institutions that are charged with proclaiming that message and shepherding the people? There are too many stories of abuse and tragedy and mistreatment and destruction coming out of today's church. Evangelical churches love to count the numbers of people that come through the front door, the number of people who come to Christ, the number of people who are baptized. The front door of the church is a joyful place. But what is not seen is the triage tents set up out of the back door of a church. That percentage of people who get burned, battered, and bruised by church and whose exit is ignored, hidden, and at its worst, mocked and criticized. I've heard an argument that the media attention that scandals like Mark Driscoll at Mars Hill, Hillsong Church's Downward Slide, and Bill Hybels at Willow Creek are making Christians believe that problems at the church are being overblown. I would say, in counter to that, how many people should be hurt by a church that proclaims a message of love, peace, and hope? Wouldn't one be too much? So where am I? I am untangling the good and the bad. I have deconstructed my faith in search of a foundation to rebuild. I have found that foundation. I have stripped the church and its leaders and members away and found these truths for me. I believe in God. I believe in Jesus. I believe that Jesus' life of love and forgiveness and truth is a pretty good foundation. When it comes to church, well, I mentioned earlier in that Newport News hospital room that I saw something happening and I wanted to be a part of it. 20 plus years later, I find myself looking around saying something is happening here and I'm not sure I want to be a part of it. To continue these thoughts, I had a conversation with Dave Roberts. David is an associate pastor at Watershed, a progressive, non-denominational church in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's been in vocational pastoral ministry for 12 years and has a master's degree in intercultural theology from Fuller Theological Seminary, where his focus was on post-evangelical congregations. He lives in Matthews, North Carolina with his wife Amy and his children Marina, Clara, and Leia. Having followed Watershed's services a bit on YouTube, I saw that they were doing things different than a lot of churches I've encountered. While their progressive theology may not be for everyone, the thing that I admired looking at them from afar is that it seems they are adept at working with and helping those Christians that found themselves in the back of the church triage tents at other churches. I really enjoyed my conversation with David, and I hope you do too. Thank you, David, for joining me today on Celebrate the Gray.
Absolutely.
Let's get started, if you don't mind, just giving me a bit of a background on your faith journey, religious experience, where you're at this point.
Sure. Yeah. So, as I'm sure many would say, they grew up in a Christian home. So for the most part, either like quasi-Baptist, non-denominational, evangelical style churches my whole life. And I would add mega churches my whole life. So the church that I currently work at, that I'll get to in a moment, is the first time I've been a part of a church under 1,000 people at any point in my life. And so pretty straightforward growing up as far as that goes, more conservative theological orientation, and didn't really at any point have any kind of like backslide, fall away, exodus experience. Kept faith through college, secular university, undergrad. There was, the normal stereotypical stuff, questions about like evolution or, the first time I met gay people in real life, things like that. But I came out of college still believing mostly the way I did growing up, so much so that soon after college, I ended up getting into ministry. And it was being in full-time vocational pastoral ministry that really sort of began my journey. Many might refer to it as deconstruction or faith evolution, but sort of out of a mainstream evangelical expression and into, I don't know, I would probably describe myself now as post-evangelical. And we can get into that perhaps if it's relevant to the conversation, what I mean by that. But currently I am working at a church called Watershed in Charlotte, North Carolina. And Watershed would probably describe itself as post-evangelical. And by that we mean that most, not all, but most of the people showing up have evangelicalism in their spiritual heritage, both theologically, but also liturgically, like what the Sunday morning or the worship experience might have looked like as far as what kind of music gets played, what the sermon or the message looks like. So all of that would be really recognizable to someone who grew up in the settings that I grew up in. But what's different about it is the way that we approach a lot of traditional theological or doctrinal positions, and also then what involvement and inclusion looks like. So it's a fully affirming church when it comes to the LGBTQIA community. So there is no limit in our church as to like whether or not a gay, trans, lesbian, bi, queer person could serve, teach, get married, baptized, etc. So those would really be probably the two most noticeable differences right off the bat, would be our stance towards the LGBTQ plus community, and then maybe some evolved, progressive, whatever buzzword you want to use, positions on some pretty big theological things like salvation, heaven, hell, creation, things like that.
Good. You're hitting you're hitting a lot of the things that have been rolling around in my head lately. I'm going to start with kind of where you started. This is the first church that you said you've been a part of that hasn't been a mega church type. So, and I'm going to link two things together here when I'm talking about the church, but being like a mega church / celebrity type church where the pastor is the leader and holds some clout. People kind of walk around and say, hey, did you see this person or did you see this person? So that's kind of where I'm talking about. That's been a problem for Christianity here recently, with the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast coming out, and then the Willow Creek having issues, and just a couple weeks ago, Hillsong. I mean, I think they've closed half of their churches at this point in the U.S. in the last month because of scandal. So the throwing post evangelical into that, it really, evangelical churches have baggage to them right now. What do you think about when you're looking from an outside world? It looks like Christianity's in a mess, which I think it is, but it also seems to me that the more progressive Christianity is actually, I think, if I had to put a hypothesis on it, is going to end up making it stronger and better for the younger people and their beliefs and where they are right now. So that was wide ranging, but if you could pull something out of that and give me your thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, so I wrestle with this. I mean, on the one hand, it's my vocation. I mean something different now than what I used to, but I would still maybe use the language of calling to describe why I do what I do. It feels meaningful to me. And so I have an investment in it. I believe in it in really real ways. It's not just a job. It is the way that I pay the bills, but it's also, and there might be some hubris or some, I don't know, delusion in this, but it feels important. There are more lucrative, less stressful things I could be doing with my day than what I do. And yet I have worries, doubts when it comes to this post-evangelical expression. And what I mean by that is I don't think that the only thing problematic or toxic about evangelicalism is the theology, or said another way, I don't know how realistic it is to really separate theology from practice and praxis and structure. And so for a church like Watershed, and many, we're not the only church like this in the country. We're part of a network of churches, loosely kind of affiliated. I'm on the board of a church planning organization that's trying to reproduce churches like a Watershed. And so even within that, I wonder if we can sort of have our cake and eat it too. Can we create more inclusive, more just, more generous theologies while retaining some of, certainly not all, but some of the sort of the structure, the liturgy, the shape of the evangelical church? Now, to put that practically, to your point about celebrity pastors, so Watershed has a teaching team. So there's not one lead pastor, not one personality. We have a team of 7 people, a mix of men, women, generational differences, orientation differences, racial, ethnic, kind of cultural differences, and stylistic differences. I mean, if you stick around Watershed, if you come 2 months straight, you'll experience 7 different speakers, 7 different styles, backgrounds, etc. I think that's healthy. It avoids a cult of personality. It avoids the celebrity culture. So that's one shift. But the format's the same. It's still a talking head standing in front of everyone, speaking wisdom down to them, upon them. Even in a more diverse, inclusive, egalitarian model, there is still a top-down hierarchical element. And so I don't know. I mean, some of it's practical. Some of it's familiar for people. It'd be maybe too jarring for someone coming out of a context like the one you and I described from for ourselves, to come to something that's just like so radically unrecognizable as what they know church to be. So I don't know, but I do worry about this. I mean, I don't know. And maybe that's the healthy position to be in, kind of doing the best you can, always kind of self-critiquing a little bit, being ready to receive pushback if maybe some of the more unhealthy elements of evangelicalism sort of sneak or smuggle their way into some of these new expressions, new iterations, if that makes sense.
I think so. And I think that it is something that you go to church, and the church is the church, it's the people. But the typical church experience is everybody goes, sits, listens to worship, listens to a message, and heads out. And it's just kind of the crux of it is a teaching. It's a seminar, versus where I've been leaning more recently, because leaving a church that we were at for 17 years and the pandemic and all, church has been not a building for us. I see it as more, when the neighbors come over for a fire and s'mores on a Friday night and everybody's together and there and being kind to each other. And, or, I have coffee with friends a couple times a week, or, I have a men's small group that we're in, that there's, 6, 7, 8 of us for me, the last few years at church has felt less like church, versus my smaller groups that I'm in that we're kind of really doing life together feels more like the church that's talked about in the Bible. That's, just so.
Absolutely. And I mean, we have our own version of that, and I'm not even sure if what you're experiencing is unique to the post-evangelical, progressive, deconstructed church. I mean, I remember like noticing there was a shift in the churches I grew up in, which were all conservative, going from sort of like a Sunday school model where everyone would come for 2 hours. The first hour would be more class, smaller, it was still teaching oriented. There was still someone at the front of the room kind of speaking to the rest of the room, but it was a smaller group. It was more discussion based. And then the service, with the songs and the sermon and things like that, maybe with communion or Eucharist, those elements. And then somewhere, around the turn of the millennium, maybe, 5-10 years into it, that format was all but gone, at least I can't speak for like mainline settings, but at least in like evangelical Baptist non-denominational spaces, and it was all small groups. And then even within that, I have friends, clergy friends who were part of like a house church movement, like really, to your point, moving away from the focus on Sunday and really elevating the rest of the week, and, shared meals together, discussions around a book or a topic and things like that. And then within those, maybe perhaps more shared or flat leadership models and things like that. So, and Watershed has versions of that. Really, the pandemic very practically has scrambled that for us. And we're still sort of sorting out, like, being torn between, do we go back to what we were doing before now that we can, or getting to the place in this pandemic so far that we can, or is this an opportunity to hit the reset button even more? But it's an open question for us. Should we do that? We call them blocks here, but we had a vision or a format or kind of a notion of small groups here at Watershed, which were very much, scrambled during the pandemic. And now that we can more or less go back to those, the question is kind of, do we? We just had a decently sized event 2 weekends ago where we invited anyone who wanted to be, but a lot of people, within our community, including people who don't really go here anymore, to give us feedback. Is like, okay, like what do you want from community? What does church mean to you? And we're still processing that information. There was facilitators and feedback forms and a whole lot went into it, just because it's not just theology. It's not just propositional beliefs that we're wrestling with and reckoning with. It's does the shape of what we mean by church and community, does that even make sense anymore? Not just because our theology has evolved, but because our culture, our society has evolved, digitally, the kind of jobs people do, the work rhythms people have, the family rhythms, all of that's changing.
Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of leads me into a question, because my first experience with a church that is similar to Watershed and what I've seen, maybe a little more extreme, was I read a couple books by Nadia Bolz-Weber.
Yeah.
She had a House of All Sinners and Saints out in Denver, and it was, wide open, anything goes kind of stuff, but liturgical. it's an when you start thinking about churches, because a church like House for All Sinners or Saints or Watershed, you're not necessarily going to get a 75-year-old Baptist man to walk through the door and come to that service. So on one hand, you were like, church should be for anybody. You should be able to walk into in my, utopian experience, anybody should be able to walk into a Christian church anywhere and just kind of fit in. But it's hard to do, especially as customized as we like our world now. This is the kind of music I like, and this is the kind of, I met somebody who was actually younger than me recently who told me they prefer organ music at a church. And I'm like, wow, you're like the first person I've ever met that prefers organ music. But so is it even possible to have a homogeneous environment or that everybody can come into and everybody's going to like it? Or do we need all types of different kinds of churches where the reason I ask the question is because you start to worry, because somebody who would look at Watershed and see the affirmation of LGBTQ, they may look at it and say, this isn't even Christian, or, that sort of thing. So where do you see the role of churches in trying to market to a broad swatch of Christians, or should we even be trying that?
It's a great question. And I feel like there's like 5 different directions.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head, I could take it.
It's not an easy question. This was in my list. It was the list of things we don't have answers for.
Yeah. So I'll just sort of ramble, and hopefully something coherent emerges. Things that popped into my head as you were verbalizing the question. So one is, I do think that there's a difference between, some more progressive mainline expressions and a non-denominational situation like Watershed. And Nadia's church is interesting because she's Lutheran, and so the way that she and their community is showing up isn't quite as maybe mainline high church liturgical as like a progressive Episcopal church, but then is also doing something a little different than Watershed. So, to some degree, churches for whom liturgy and the church calendar and the Book of Common Prayer and the lectionary are kind of give structure, give you a sandbox to play in, so to speak. That's going to create, I think, a kind of, common ground for someone who perhaps they might experience the LGBTQ inclusion piece as disorienting, or perhaps they might experience, being stretched around, a church's soteriology, their doctrine of salvation, or their eschatology, end time stuff, heaven, hell stuff, disorienting. But there's still this familiarity to cling to when it comes to, okay, I recognize some of these hymns, or I recognize, this at my old, more conservative church, we would be exploring this same passage in the lectionary, or, hey, it's the Lenten season, I recognize that. At a non-denominational church like Watershed, or a similar one, there's increasingly a lot, but there's 10, 12 off the top of my head, similar size, similar structured kind of non-denominational post-evangelical churches across the country like Watershed. There's probably more than that. That's just what I know about. To varying degrees, you're not going to necessarily have that liturgical anchor. And so to your point, or by contrast, the liturgical anchor is the very thing that I was worried about. It is the fact that we're playing kind of contemporary music with the guitars and drums and stuff like that. It's the fact that the sermon could, we joke here, we're called Watershed. One of my volunteers recently started referring to the sermons as shed talks, like TED Talks. But stylistically, that's correct. Our sermons are often more structured like a TED Talk than they are like a homily that you might experience like a Catholic church or an Episcopal church. The dress, the youth group looks more like a non-denominational church. And so there's these, I guess maybe one thought to answer your question is, when the theology gets disorienting, the rhythms, the liturgy, the practice is what people use to orient themselves. And so that, at least from an explanation standpoint, is, I think, a little bit why we have been, at least we being Watershed, more cautious, more slow, more reluctant to evolve liturgically, programmatically, as far as like what the service looks like formally, because we know that we're already disorienting people really, really heavily on the theological side. We know that they are going to be challenged, sufficiently challenged, maybe beyond many people's thresholds on the teaching content. So we need to give them something recognizable, something that is not, if they came in and immediately we circled up all the chairs and, and I don't know, I can just imagine different format tweaks we could do. Yeah, someone might be like, yeah, I'm out. Like,
yeah,
too much.
Yeah. So it's worship, announcements, message, maybe some more worship, everybody. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And it really, and I don't think you could ever have one type of church. Just people are too different. But I worry that the amount of different denominations that we have just creates division amongst Christians.
It's a live question. I think it's a live question that's being asked across the theological, political spectrum. Is what does the word Christian mean? And I see conservatives talking about this. I see progressive friends talking about this. A mentor of mine is actually writing a book on this right now, and there's going to be other books, because people look around the last 5-6 years politically, and you've got people on, I guess, both sides of the partisan left-right, Republican, Democrat political aisle claiming Christianity as an identity and accusing the other side of not being a true or real Christian. So what makes someone a Christian? Is Christianity descriptive? Is it every person who has self-identified as a Christian throughout history, we have to take that at face value and then just evaluate or articulate, assess, examine what is meant by Christianity, sort of retrospectively looking back at, well, all of these things claim Christianity, so we have to account for all of them. Or is it prescriptive? Is it, no, these practices, these postures, these beliefs, whatever, these form the bounds or the boundaries of Christianity, and we can contend them, we can debate them, contest them amongst ourselves, and we're probably not going to all agree. But what we do agree on is that there is a boundary, and you can fall outside of it. Yeah. I've got opinions on that, and I'm not even 100% sure if some of the people I pastor with here at Watershed share my opinions. There's that would probably be not in a conflictual, like, breaking fellowship or breaking relationship way, but that would probably be something like if you lined up our 7-person teaching team and asked them, what does it mean to be a Christian? I'm not sure if you would get 7 different answers, but you would at least get 3 or 4.
Yeah, I could see that. And that's kind of where I've been over the last period of time, of just really, because I was pretty conservative, both politically and religiously. And I was starting to feel icky around some of those, technical term, icky, around some of those beliefs. And I was like, you know what? I got to just stop. And and deconstruction is thrown away. It's just kind of a throwaway word at this point, but that's what it was. It was like, all right, I'm going to break everything down and get to some base, and because I don't like where I'm at here. I don't like where I'm at here. This is okay, but I got to think about this more. But what is the rock? If I'm going to be a Christian, where do I stop? And I'm like, all right, do you believe in God? Yes, I believe in God. It's like, do you believe in Jesus? Yes, Jesus was a person. Do you think Jesus was God in human form? I'm pretty solid on that. And it was like, all right, what did they teach us? Love. I was like, okay, that's it. And then I'm responsible for myself. If there's anything that's in the Bible, it's the only person I can really control or worry about in my circle is me and how I treat people and so whether something is a sin, not a sin, that sort of thing, and somebody else is doing it, that really doesn't concern me that much. Like, I have enough problems here with me that I need to work on, that I don't really need to focus that much on what all these other people are doing. So that's just kind of where I landed in that base.
Mm-hmm.
And then then I started looking around and be like, all right, where's church with that? So just kind of where I'm at. You can respond to that or not respond to it, but I thought,
I mean, that tracks. I mean, so many people. It's interesting the way that people end up either at Watershed specifically, at a church like Watershed, or at no church. For whatever reason, so many of our people, they kind of just decided what where they used to be church wise, belief wise, ethics wise, wasn't working anymore, and they found a community like Watershed where, okay, they can invite their LGBTQ friends. Great. Or the anxiety that they were feeling about eternal conscious torment in hell. Well, we're like, that's not a thing. So, be free of that. And all they needed was the community of people who were free of that, or at least wanted to be free of that. And that's all they needed. And then we have other people for whom they want that, but you need to show your work. So like, show me biblically, show me philosophically, show me scientifically, or some combination thereof. How did you get there? The apologetics of it. Honestly, like I'm at the point now where like specifically like on the LGBTQ question, like I'm kind of ambivalent on the apologetics now, but I had to go through the apologetic. I had to go through the scriptural theological argument to get there, to get to the point where I got comfortable enough with it that now I can sort of retroactively kind of be like, yeah, whatever. So I have a lot of sympathy, a lot of empathy for the people who sort of need the steps. They need the process, how you get there. Some version of what you described of kind of tearing it all down and then kind of building it up, from the base. But then, in my real lived experience as a pastor in a community like this, then I run into these complications, good complications, but like just by way of example, I teach a class here called Reclamation. And what it is it's 3 or 4 times a year, I pick a topic, we pick a topic, it's voted on sometimes of like a broad theological category, like heaven, hell, God, sin, salvation. And I spend 4 weeks kind of talking about like, okay, like almost like this is like, you have heard it said, now I say to you sort of format, like, hey, this is what we all grew up with. Here's why I think broadly speaking, that's not working for us anymore. And it's not just me talking, like people share like where they're at with that doctrine or with that belief. And then we explore ways to reclaim it, to kind of say, no, we're not going to just throw the baby out with the bathwater. Toss it. Like, what could that mean? Not in a choose your own adventure, everything is relative sort of way, but like, let's actually get into the text of scripture. Let's look at the history and like, it doesn't have to mean what it used to mean. But I was doing one of these classes around sin and salvation. And, I spent 3 weeks going through like, all right, this idea of salvation where maybe many of us grew up, thinking of it as it's completely post mortem, like after you die, you go to heaven or hell. And what decides that? Well, it's this prayer that you pray or this faith that you have in Jesus, blah, blah, blah. And so I spent all this time going back and saying like, okay, that's definitely not what it meant contextually, historically, biblically, in the context that Jesus, the Gospels are written in the context that Paul was writing in the New Testament. So what did they mean then? And how do we contextualize that for now? And honestly, we did all that and I was like, this is great. This is fun, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end of it, like a handful of people in the group were like, nah, we want the old version. We want the pray the prayer and go to heaven version. We just want you to show us and tell us that gay people can be included. And so even within this kind of more progressive, inclusive context, there was a progressive element to it. They wanted it to be more inclusive, but there was still a degree, and this is fine, but there was still a degree to which they really, really wanted the evangelical packaging, if that makes sense. And so it's not even in a broadly progressive space when when most everyone here is sort of in agreement as to like, well, we're not that anymore. There's not necessarily going to be a clear consensus on what we are or what we, and at a very practical level, it was easier when there was 7 things or 13 things, and we were just kind of like, yeah, it is what it is. Those are the things.
There's a comfort, I guess, to that brand of salvation too. That it's just, I prayed the prayer, I meant it when I did it, and now I'm kind of set. But then individually, I read Rob Bell, Love Wins recently, and then we did it as a Bible study with my men's group, and people were uncomfortable with some of that stuff because it was like, oh, this isn't what I thought. I don't know. But it was an interesting exercise because he's got some real thoughts on. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but it's okay. It's different, and I actually remember when it was the time it was taken out of our church bookstore at a point, and then that kind of ended his pastoral time.
It did, yeah.
And it was just kind of crazy, but it was just a different thought of it. And I loved the sentiment behind it. Do you believe in a God who gives you this unknown length of time to be tested on whether you're going to spend your eternal life in torment or paradise? It was like, I don't know if I can believe in that God. So It's just, the question is profound, but there is security in, if you're in the club, that you're in the club,
right? And
everybody else is outside the club. So I don't know.
I think you're right about the security thing. I noticed, when you reached out to me and then I went like Facebook stalked you and social media and just looked at, and you talk a lot about like, and I love this, like talk a lot about like being okay with, I don't know.
Yeah.
And that's exactly it. Like I want to get people to a place in our context where scripture, for example, the Bible, not being a comprehensive user manual for being human and for, I guess, eternity after you die, is freeing. Like, okay, no, like Paul in Romans wasn't specifically talking about you. He didn't have you in mind. That's not how inspiration works. That doesn't mean that there's nothing here for you. I think Romans is one of the most relevant books in the New Testament for us right now, but not for really any of the reasons that I was raised with. It's not this how-to manual for your eternal security or certainty. And even progressive people, even people who are comfortable with, a non-inerrant scripture, or comfortable or really, really longing and reveling in a more generous and inclusive faith experience around people of different orientation, race, gender, whatever. Certainty is a hell of a drug. And that is a hard thing to give up. If anything, the challenge for them is, they want to be just as certain as they were before. They just want to be certain now that people who they used to be certain weren't in are.
Yeah, that strikes a chord because, I ask a lot of questions. The people who will sit down and have a talk with me about this kind of stuff, is like, I get to the end of it and I'm like, man, what do people think? Because I don't, no topics off limits. I'll be willing to kind of banter around any sort of topics. But the other day, I was at a group and, we were talking and somebody asked me a question and it was something about certainty. And I was like, let me stop you. I was like, I would love to be certain. Like it's not a fun place to be, to have as many questions as I'm having about things. It's very uncomfortable. Certainty would be much easier, to just blindly just believe it and move on. But it's where I'm at. So I had to stop and be like, this isn't easy. This is very uncomfortable. And I'd much rather be in your shoes that you're certain that this thing is settled for you. But,
oh yeah. I get accused. I think out of genuine concern. So I want to be charitable to the people in my life who are leveling this accusation. But I get accused of people who are still very much in the faith expression that I have left. The version of Christianity, of evangelicalism that I have left, and quite frankly have been kicked out of. Who accuse me of taking an easy way out or caving to culture, blah blah blah. And I'm like, I guess on paper, I guess in the abstract, I understand what you mean. In part because evangelicalism revels in a kind of woe is me persecution complex that I was very much caught up in myself when I was in that world. But when I think about what me, I guess, following my convictions has done to me vocationally, relationally, financially, the toll it's taken on my mental health, the sacrifices my family. I mean, if anything, the sacrifice that and fortunately my wife and I have been on the same page about this the whole time. So it's not been something that I've necessarily imposed upon my family. There's been a mutuality to it for us, but neither of us could stay where we were. And so we did it together. But nothing about this has been easy. I've experienced from an emotional mental health, I've experienced the lowest of lows in my life. Precisely because the only thing I was certain about is I couldn't be certain that way anymore. And it used to really bother me. I guess hopefully this is believable, me saying it out loud, but I feel like I've made peace with that. Now I understand where people are coming from in that. But if anything, if I was to try to distill down what I mean by the gospel at this stage in my journey in my life, a kind of uncertainty would be foundational to it. In many ways, the certainty that people crave, that I crave, that we all crave, there's an idolatry to it. And if the Bible is about anything, in my opinion, if the Bible is about anything, I would argue it's a polemic, it's a diatribe, it's an argument against, from literally from Genesis to Revelation, against idolatry. And the way that idolatry manifests more often than not is two words I would use are certainty and control. And they go hand in hand. The certainty justifies the control, and so, but it's a tough pill to swallow for me too. I get it.
Yeah, no. And actually, a friend of ours started going to Watershed recently, which is why you guys hopped up on my radar. So I've watched some messages, and I think the first one I watched, I don't remember who was speaking, but he said from the pulpit some form of like, this is just kind of this is what I'm thinking about what I'm reading right now, or this is a hypothesis or an idea of something I've been mulling over about the Bible. Like, I'm not sure if I'm right, but here you go. It was like, wow, that's really refreshing to hear from somebody standing up on the pulpit, because I hear a lot of, this is what the Bible says, and the truth is, and this. And when you talk about idolatry, I think the biggest idol that has popped up is the Bible. Mm-hmm. Like that, all of a sudden it's like, here it is. This is the truth right here. I've got the truth. Here it is right here in my hand. And it's like, well, what does it really say? Mm-hmm. Are you sure? There's probably truth in there, but I don't know if your interpretation of the truth is so. People interpreting the Bible for what they want it to say and then speaking it as truth. One is, I think it's ignorant, but I think on the other side, it's dangerous. And that's mm-hmm. where that power comes from. And our Willow Creek and our Mars Hill and our Hillsong stories and on pour out of that, is using the Bible and the scripture as a weapon of certainty.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think you could build a whole I know because to some degree I have, or at least have learned from, or sort of, sunk my teeth into theologies built around that sentiment. And what I mean by that is um, exploring why it is that both that someone on the leadership side or the pastoral side of things would find themselves peddling that kind of gospel or peddling that kind of certainty, and also on the flip side, congregationally, why someone would be attracted to that.
It goes both ways.
Yeah, you've mentioned so you've mentioned some concrete examples that I think we can name here. Okay, so like Mars Hill was, I was a big, huge Mark Driscoll fan for years. Mars Hill was part of this broader neo-Calvinist movement. That theology had, to oversimplify, you probably know this, this expression of theology, Calvinism, it's all about God's absolute sovereignty, God's control. Famously, I think it was R.C. Sproul, maybe kind of this old like previous generation, kind of celebrity pastor in that space, said that there's not a maverick molecule in the universe. God is controlling it. And it's not hard, and many people certainly have walked away from this theology because of the ethical, moral implications of that. But on the flip side, there is something comforting about that in the midst of, and it's not surprising to me that this theology rose to prominence in the wake of 9/11 in the United States. So you have this 90s decade, the 1990s, post-Cold War, where it was like, we won. Like the American dream is now going to be proliferated across the world, and everything's great, and economically it was pretty nice, and blah, blah, blah. And then 9/11 happened, and for so many people just shattered that sense of certainty and security. So it's not surprising to me that a theology that was offering that level of control became popular. Now, you mentioned Hillsong. Nothing. The fastest growing, I guess, religious expression on the planet is Pentecostalism. And I appreciate things about the Pentecostal expression of faith. I've got some friends and mentors who are very much, subscribe or would identify themselves within that tradition. But broadly speaking, Pentecostalism is it's associated with like name it and claim it, prosperity thinking, and things like that. And we live in a time, at least in the modern period, in the contemporary era, when in the United States and all over the world, like the wealth disparity and the precarity people feel as far as being able to provide for their families, the burnout and exhaustion that our culture of consumption creates, of course people are going to be drawn to that. And so in both of those instances, it's almost like a market-based consumer vision of the church, wherein a kind of theology rises up to respond to the immediate, like, emotional, physical, and material needs of the people. And I get that. And yet, what does it look like for what could it or what should it look like for a church to sort of stand in protest to, in opposition to, counter to that? And you could make a conservative or a progressive argument about that, what that kind of space would look like. But it is interesting to me and I guess it tracks for me that the kind of like consumeristic, celebrity driven church expressions that have both risen and fallen in the last 20 years speak so directly to the emotional, mental, material needs of the moment, at least in this country, at least in the United States.
Mm-hmm. That leads right into, I heard this quote a long time ago, and I've searched it out a few times, but it was on Richard Rohr's podcast, Another Name for Everything.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, it started Christianity. It was originally offered in Israel as an experience. It moved to Greece and became a philosophy. It moved to Rome, became an organized religion, moved to Europe and became a culture. And then it moved to America and became a business. And that just church in America is a business. It's a huge business. Not that it isn't anywhere else, but when you look at it, it looks like any other company. There's marketing and there's merchandise and there's packaging and there's, of course, your staffing and your buildings and your not that a church has to make money to survive. You have to, but it is the CEO leadership that kind of came out of the 80s, 90s is just seems like it's running really rampant of, strong leaders, and we're going to make this flashy. And I don't know your thoughts on that quote. That quote hit me some way, and it's just kind of stuck with me through years.
It's a great quote. And so I just got done leading a group through an experience curated by a guy named Pete Rollins. I don't know if you're familiar with that name. And the experience, and this might be jarring for some people listening, is called Atheism for Lent. And the basic premise is during the 40-day Lenten season, Pete, who's a theologian and philosopher, leads people through not in the simplest form, it's through atheism, but not necessarily in like the evangelical kind of mainstream atheism that you might find in like a Richard Dawkins, someone who's just like really kind of bombastically, or the comedian, TV host, whatever he is, Bill Maher or something like that. There's a little of that, but it's a mix of both atheists, skeptics, agnostics, but also theists, throughout church history, who very much wrestled with the experience of the absence of God. So, so Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was executed by the Nazis in World War II, and Mother Teresa, who after her death, many of her private journals were released, and it was shown that this modern day saint wrestled with all sorts of doubts in her work and things like that. So, But two of the names, and this is going to ring some alarm bells for some people, one of them at least, two of the names that you look at are these German guys, Ludwig Feuerbach and then Karl Marx, known for communism. And Marx's points, Marx was sort of agnostic himself when it came to whether or not there really was or wasn't a transcendent reality, a God, a higher being out there. But his point was very practically, how does religion function? And his very infamous quote about religion being the opiate of the masses, that wasn't him arguing necessarily against religion. He saw great value. He saw religion as this necessary thing because of the lived reality, the material conditions of religion rises up to support people in their need. And in the American, in kind of the modern capitalist American culture economy, to Richard Rohr's quote is, we have a hyper-competitive, scarcity mentality modeled culture, and it's we value it. I mean, it is instilled into the fabric of our cultural collective identity. This idea of meritocracy and the American dream. If you just work hard enough, if you hustle, there are so many books right now being written about hustling and making sure your kids have grit, and parents are worried that their kids are not going to be able to survive in the competitive marketplace of skills and abilities. And so they're investing earlier and earlier in sports programs and art programs and things like that. So I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek and a little bit intentionally provocative in saying this, but Rohr's quote, which I agree is phenomenal, is Marxist. And not in the communism, like economic, not in the sense that most people associate with Karl Marx, but it's very consistent with the way that he looked around the world at his time, 200 some odd years ago, and said, yeah, like religion is serving the purpose to sort of both really to uphold the status quo. And Marx's critique of religion was not a critique intended to turn people into atheists, he didn't really care whether you believed in God or not. What he was worried about is the way that religion was being co-opted by oppressive forces within culture to exploit and marginalize people. And in that sense, even though it looks much different now in contemporary 21st century America than it did in, 19th century Germany or whatever he was when he was writing, you're seeing versions of that. You're seeing even well-meaning. I don't think pastors in evangelical settings or otherwise are sitting around like, kind of twisting their villain mustaches and giving each other high fives because their master plan has worked. I think people usually are sincere, well-intentioned,
Mm-hmm.
but in many ways, the ways and means, the shapes and structures of our churches and of our faith systems have taken on forms that allow us to keep our heads above the water, um, spiritually, relationally, emotionally, and to some degree, I'm all for that because people need a break. And there's another part of me that's like, and yet, is there a space in there for religion to serve the alternate purpose of almost a more prophetic, to use kind of the Old Testament prophets example of like, no, of tearing down structures of oppression, tearing down systems and assumptions that keep both the oppressed and the oppressor. I really want to blur that line. There's a lot of talk in progressive church spaces about, accountability and privilege, and those are important conversations that I'm all for. And I think one of the most important things to see them is to see sort of like the blurring of the lines when it comes to complicity. Like there's a sense, I'll put it this way because I'm talking too much, to sort of close my thought here is,
No, you're good.
There's a sense in which liberation for the oppressed is also by necessity liberation for the oppressor. And that at least gets at and speaks to and hopefully undermines that sort of either or binary sort of oppositional division that I think people on both sides of the ideological, political aisle, what have you, religious aisle, kind of want to set up. Because again, that's another form of certainty. If I have a clear enemy, if I know who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, even if it's a kind of a mutually assured destruction, there's at least a catharsis. There's at least a comfort in having the battle lines clearly drawn.
Yeah. And it's being a pastor, I can't imagine is easy. Like there's a lot of eyeballs looking at you and people have expectations. So running a church, being in a church, I can't imagine is easy. And I ask a lot of questions, and I think the questions tend to, people see it as, I don't know, negative, but they're really, they put a lot into it. We've been at church one form or another since my wife and I've been married for 20 years, 21 years now. Been going together. You put a lot of time, you put a lot of effort, you put a lot of trust in it. And when you're breaking up with it somewhat, if it was easy, there's so many questions because it's hard and I care about it and I think it's important. Mm-hmm. So I know sometimes people may see it as coming off as being hard towards the church and the people that work there. And I know my wife has worked at the church. It's not easy. It's a lot of hours. It's a lot of, and people looking at you and expecting things that really shouldn't be expected from you.
Sure.
But at the same time, can it be better? And I think it's really, really important. So just to add that on the backside, just so you know that I'm not coming after church necessarily, but just kind of figuring out how is it going to work for people going into the future.
Sure. And not that you're fishing for this or looking for this, but no, I mean, I don't think, at least in our conversations here today, no, I don't think any of your questions have felt overly critical or negative. I would hope that these are questions that we as clergy persons, as pastors, as supposed faith leaders would be asking of ourselves, hopefully. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. I'm 100% right there with you on that.
All right. I'll give you the last word if you would like it, if you want to say anything, if you have any questions, or if you think there's a question that I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about. So
I guess I'll say this. Amidst all of my wondering, all of my curiosity, even at times pessimism when it comes to whether or not our faith expressions are, I guess, really really reflecting the things that we're aspiring towards and claiming we're aspiring towards. So even in all the ways that we fall short, I'm still personally, I think the church is something worth investing in. And that's going to look different for people. There are people who should not be in church right now. They need space. They've been hurt. They've been abused. And if they never come back, I don't think that that's going to mean that they are in some way like irreparably separated from God or anything like that. And yet, I still think the church has something to model, to offer, to contribute, to our world. And I hope I'll still, I'll get to keep being a part of that in the years to come. But if not, so be it. But I still think it's important. And so whether or not someone who just listened to this believes me on that or not, I leave up to the listener. But know that from where I'm sitting, I genuinely do still think that this is important work.
Cool. And I completely agree. So I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. And I wish you all the best coming up for you and Watershed.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve.
Okay. Thank you. If you'd like to hear more conversations like this, I'm going to put in a plug for my wife, Julie Wagner's podcast, Celebrate Story. She interviewed last week Laura Barringer, who wrote a book called A Church Called Tove, which dove into the Willow Creek Bill Hybels situation, plus added some interesting thoughts on what church might look like in the future to make it a little more healthy. And coming up, she's interviewing two more very well-known Christian authors who have wrote books on this similar topic. Different topics, but in the same vein. So these are going to be great interviews to tune into. So go ahead and subscribe to Celebrate Story. You can find that on Apple or at celebratestorypod.com. And if you liked my conversation today and you'd like more like it, please find me on social media, like the podcast on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll talk to you next time.